So we're on to our third subject, which is historic evidence for the Bible. So the question is, what other evidence do we have for God then? Let's start with a neutral subject, historical evidence. Jay Smith, an apologist and polemicist to Muslims, has a good summary video on historic evidence for the Bible. I have a link to his video in the description, and I highly recommend everyone go watch it after this video, or whenever you have some free time. As a bit of background on Jay Smith, he used to give tours of the British Museum, and all of his apologetic and polemic arguments are on a historical basis alone. He also has a video that obliterates the historic foundation of Islam based on new historical research, which I also have linked. If you like to see what a false religion looks like, look no further than his videos on Islam, but I digress. Back to the topic at hand, I'll do what I can to briefly summarize some of the most compelling historic evidence for the Bible, followed by a defense of some of its most common critiques related to the Exodus and the Flood. This will not be an exhaustive list by any means, only a brief and spotty summary to show that we have ample evidence. I plan to do another video to go through historic artifacts and other evidence for the Bible's historicity at another time. Now, some of you may be aware of the online rhetoric and debate about whether or not the Jews actually existed in Israel prior to modern times. It's a ridiculous debate, but I'll go through some evidence very quickly. There are some big names on social media that outright deny the Jews' historic claims to Israel, stating that Roman maps around the time of Jesus listed Israel as Palestina. However, this overlooks thousands of historical artifacts and the fact that Palestina was meant as an insult. It was the Roman way of saying that the land belonged to the Philistines, the Jews' longtime enemy. This renaming was done by Emperor Hadrian in 135 AD, specifically in response to riots by Jews. The history of the Jews and the 12 tribes of Israel is undeniable when looking at artifacts, so let's begin. The Amarna tablets contain multiple letters from Canaanite kings to the Pharaoh of Egypt dated to the mid-14th century BC, around the time that Joshua would have invaded Israel. They describe the Apiru, also called Habiru or Hapiru in Akkadian, invading their lands and seizing cities. Biblical scholars have pointed out that Hapiru sounds very similar to the word Hebrew. Historians interpret this word to mean displaced people, not necessarily Hebrews. However, we will come back to this. Nevertheless, this is not the only piece of evidence that we have for the Hebrews in Canaan around this time. The Merneptah Stele, discovered in 1896 and dated to 1208 BC, is the earliest direct mention of Israel being the people of Canaan. Again, this backs up the biblical historians' interpretation that the Israeli tribes had invaded around the mid-14th century and had established a nation. Now let's discuss some of the people specifically confirmed by historic evidence present in the Old Testament. I'll limit myself to the top 5 in interest of time, but just know that there are over 50 people from the Old Testament alone that have been directly confirmed through extra-biblical evidence. That means evidence outside of the Bible. Let's start with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The Mari tablets in Syria dated to the 18th century BC, and the Nuzi tablets in Iraq dated to the 15th or 14th century BC describe marriage traditions around the time of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I'm going to combine these three into one. These three men lived somewhere between 2000 and 1500 BC according to the Bible. They don't say it specifically, but you can calculate the date. These marriage traditions include, number 1, a payment of a dowry to the bride's family before the husband could take his wife. It could be paid in silver, jewelry, sheep, or even labor. This reflects both Abraham's act of bestowing jewelry to Rebekah in Genesis 24 and Jacob's action working for Laban to marry Rachel in Genesis 29. Number 2, in cases where the wife was unable to give birth to a male heir, marriage contracts allowed for the husband to bear a male heir through the wife's slave or concubine. This is reflected in Abraham's actions sleeping with Hagar when Sarah was barren in Genesis 16, and Jacob's wives forcing their slave girls to bear more children for him on multiple occasions. Although this disobeyed the spirit of the law, it still reflects the custom. Okay, number 3. According to the Nuzi tablets, if any slave girl bore a male heir, they were protected by the marriage contract from being expelled from the family. Hence Abraham's initial resistance to expelling Hagar and her son until God commanded it in Genesis 21. Of course, he also promised to make a great nation out of Ishmael and protected he and Hagar after they were sent out. As a side note, another way to get around the male heir problem was to adopt a servant and have them take over for an absent heir. Genesis 15 mentions Abraham had considered this before his son Isaac was born. as for inheritance, verbal declarations on the deathbed of the father, similar to Isaac's accidental blessing over Jacob in Genesis 27 or Jacob's blessing over Ephraim in Genesis 48, were often used and considered binding. All of this shows that the Old Testament biblical account of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob match what we would have expected if they lived around the time these tablets were written, from the 18th to the 14th century BC. This also means the stories found in Genesis are further validated, and not later redactions based on texts like the Epic of Gilgamesh or similar texts that closely match parts of the Genesis account. We will discuss this more when we talk about the flood. Next up, let's talk about David. A basalt stone fragment dated to the mid-9th century BC, erected by an Aramean king, states that the king had been victorious over the house of David, showing the presence of David's household by that date, and implying that it had been established sometime before then. Furthermore, multiple archaeological digs confirm structures dating back to the 10th century BC that align with the biblical descriptions of David's kingdom. Now Jehu. The black obelisk dated to 841 BC depicts Jehu, king of Israel, by name and title, bowing down to Shalmaneser III. Let's go to number 4. This is a more controversial figure. King Pul. 2 Kings 15 mentions the name of the king of Syria is Pul. However, this was disputed by historians who did not find the name on their list of historic Assyrian kings. That is, until the Enkrili trilingual inscription was discovered in 1993 in Turkey and translated, which mentions that the Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser III went by the nickname Pul. This is one of many instances where the Bible was radically vindicated, putting historian doubters to shame. Now let's talk about our last figure, and probably the most controversial, both today and historically. Daniel. Many of you may not be aware, but during the 19th century, the book of Daniel of the Old Testament, Torah, was used by historian polemicists as an example of a major historical inaccuracy in the Bible. Historians claim that Daniel was written after the fact and then dated back to the Jews' exile in Babylon. Their evidence at the time was that Belshazzar wasn't in any of the historic records. They knew where Babylon was. They had searched, but they couldn't find the name Belshazzar anywhere. That is, until Assyriologist Hormuzd Rassam with the British Museum discovered the cylinder of Nabonidus during excavations at Sippar in Babylonia in 1881. On this barrel, written in cuneiform, was a prayer by Nabonidus for himself and for his son, Belshazzar. Later inscriptions found in Haran made by Nabonidus indicate Belshazzar had been crowned Prince of Babylon and entrusted with rule of the empire while Nabonidus was away. This meant Belshazzar was co-regent with Nabonidus. This is exactly what is indicated in the book of Daniel, specifically Daniel 5, where Daniel was promoted to number 3 in the kingdom for translating the writing on the wall, Mene Mene Tekel Parsin. You have been weighed and measured in the scales of life and found wanting. May none of us ever have to hear that. Why number 3 then? Because Nabonidus was number 1 and Belshazzar was number 2. Short of declaring Daniel king himself, there was no higher position he could hold in Babylon. Now, why go into all this detail? Because it shows that the book of Daniel was not only more accurate than the ever-doubtful historians, but it also shows that whoever wrote Daniel had to have lived at or near that time in the kingdom to be privy to this relationship between Nabonidus and Belshazzar, lending credence to the accuracy of the biblical narrative and its historicity. This also poses a conundrum for those who don't believe in biblical prophecy. One of the major reasons atheistic and agnostic historians zeroed in on the book of Daniel to begin with was due to its prophetic nature. If Daniel was truly written by the prophet Daniel during the Jews' exile into Babylon, then the prophetic predictions it makes about major powers of the world from Babylon to the Medo-Persian Empire to Alexander's Greece, the Maccabean Revolt, and more all came true over the next about 400 years. Furthermore, using a prophetic year of 360 days, it is possible to use Daniel's prophecy of week to predict Jesus' triumphal entry on March 30th, 33 AD, just before a lunar eclipse that aligns with the Passover 4 days later. This matches biblical events exactly, but I will leave the explanation related to this for another video. If you're interested and want to check it out in advance, you can look up the ex-lawyer Josh McDowell's explanation in his book, The New Evidence That Demands a Verdict. As Occam's razor would suggest, the explanation that makes the least number of assumptions is the truth. In this case, given the historicity of the Book of Daniel and its privy to information about the arrangement between Nabonidus and Belshazzar, it is most likely that the authors lived at or near the time of the events, meaning the prophecies of Daniel are also legitimate, not later redactions, as previously speculated by historians. Now that I've given you a very minute portion of the historical evidence for the Old Testament, let's address elephants in the room: the Exodus and the flood. Some of this will link back to my previous discussion about the Amarna tablets and the Nuzi tablets and all of that, so just keep that in mind. I'll try to bring them up when I see them. Let's start with the Exodus. Many historians say that the Exodus didn't happen, or there's no evidence for the Israelite Exodus from Egypt. However, as previously mentioned, we know the Jews were in Israel and had established a nation by 1208 BC thanks to the Merneptah stele, leading to the conclusion that they were likely the Hapiru invading around 150 years prior, mentioned on the Amarna tablets. Furthermore, thanks to the efforts of Austrian archaeologist Manfred Beitek in the 1960s, an interesting structure was discovered that is relevant to this discussion. This structure had 12 main pillars and a small pyramid-shaped tomb with a statue depicting a high-ranking official dated to between 1800 and 1700 BC. For the record, pyramid structures like this type were typically reserved only for royalty, in other words, for the pharaoh or his household. The statue also depicted a multicolored robe worn by the official, and the body was mysteriously missing from the tomb. The style of the structure did not match traditional architecture for the region, but instead had Asiatic-style features, meaning that it was likely owned by a foreigner. Now, anyone familiar with the Bible will likely be putting two and two together. A high-ranking official who was borderline royalty, a robe of many colors, 12 pillars, foreign architecture, and an empty tomb. All of these descriptions directly match Joseph, who, according to the biblical narrative in Genesis, became second only to Pharaoh in terms of power after his brothers sold him into slavery in Egypt. His father, Jacob, had given him a coat of many colors to wear, which he prided himself on. He was also willing to forgive his 11 brothers, 11 plus 1 equals 12, and accept them into the land of Egypt during a famine, even though they had betrayed him. Lastly, he instructed his sons to take his bones out of Egypt after he died and rebury them in the land of Canaan promised to them by God, and they obeyed. It's no wonder the structure was termed the House of Joseph or the Palace of Joseph by historians. This is all to say, we now have a window for when the children of Israel were in Egypt and when they left, between 1800 BC as their earliest arrival in Egypt, and sometime before 1208 BC as their latest arrival in Canaan. So what evidence do we have for an exodus between these dates? First, we have the Ipuwer Papyrus dated to 1250 BC. This describes historic events in Egypt. It was a time of chaos, social upheaval, and it specifically describes rivers turning to blood, directly matching the description of one of the 10 plagues in the Bible. Historians believe the events the Ipuwer Papyrus describes could have occurred anywhere from 1800 BC to 1550 BC. If the later date was true, this would match the destruction of Jericho, Hazor, and Ai that all occurred around the 15th century BC according to historians. According to Joshua 6, 8, and 11 of the Bible, respectively, Jericho, Hazor, and Ai were destroyed during the Israel invasion of Canaan. So what is the historian's problem with the Exodus, considering we have multiple points of extra biblical evidence matching the biblical narrative? They blindly believe that the Exodus should have occurred in the 13th century BC instead of the 15th century BC, disregarding the Bible's narrative altogether. This is obviously not the case just based on common sense. How could the Hebrews have established a nation by 1208 BC, which is the 13th century, if they had arrived less than 100 years earlier and there's no evidence of them suddenly invading Canaan or departing from Egypt? The historians have the wrong people in the wrong place at the wrong time. They ignore the archaeological evidence, which confirms biblical narrative completely because they don't want to believe the Bible is a historic book. Now, do you see the absolute bias of the historians against the Bible? They have the truth outright staring them in the face, and instead of accepting it, they deny it outright and call the Israelites' southern kingdom in Canaan a mystery. The only narrative that puts the right people in the right place at the right time according to the historic evidence is the one contained within the Bible. There's even more evidence than I have mentioned here, and if you'd like a deeper dive into the evidence for the Exodus, I highly recommend the documentary Patterns of Evidence: The Exodus by Tim Mahoney. Again, moving on from this topic since we beat it to death, let's now discuss the biblical flood. Again, historians and archaeologists protest to the idea of a global flood. However, let's start with the historic evidence and then move on to the objections. There are between 200 and 500 different civilizations worldwide that have flood accounts similar to the Bible. This includes Mesopotamian, Chinese, and Native American accounts all around the world, amongst others. Not all of these accounts are exactly the same as the Bible, but it is interesting that the eldest accounts tend to match the Bible the closest. For example, The Sumerian myth Eridu Genesis, written on tablets dated to around 1600 BC but likely composed between 2300 and 2000 BC, making it the oldest known account, describe a flood that is sent by gods to destroy humanity. King Zoisudra is warned by his god to build a boat to save himself, his family, and the animals. This almost exactly matches the Akkadian account of the flood contained on the Atrahasis tablets dated to 1800 BC. Famously, the Mesopotamian Epic of Gilgamesh, also dated to around 1800 BC, with some fragments dated up to 2100 BC, matches the biblical account of both creation and of the flood, although it is simplified by comparison to the biblical narrative. All of this seems to indicate, from a historical basis, that some sort of major natural disaster occurred sometime before these stories were written that likely inspired them. So what are the objections and the counter-explanations? First, archaeologists argue there's no worldwide sedimentary layer or mass extinction level event correlated with a global flood. They also say ancient civilizations such as Egypt and China have continuous archaeological records that are without interruption during the period where the flood supposedly happened. Now, this is a good point. Lastly, they argue that water covering the entire Earth would be impossible given the amount of total water on the Earth's surface. Now, if the flood was a localized event, all of these arguments hold no water. You see what I did there? Okay, sorry about that. Anyway, ancient Hebrew uses the word eretz, meaning land or ground. This doesn't necessarily mean the entire earth. Similarly, when the author of Genesis says all life, it could be interpreted as all local life where the flood hit, since this is otherwise implied in the text. It's also heavily implied in the biblical narrative just before the flood occurs that God's objective was to wipe out the Nephilim, the children of humans and demons. Why destroy the entire Earth's surface when that's not necessary to achieve your goal? Lastly, the Old Testament should not be taken as a generalized historical book. At best, it is the history of the Israelites and later the Jews, meaning all of it is written from their perspective. Even a local catastrophic flood might look like the end of the world from this limited perspective. There are some interesting observations one could make about the biblical narrative that turn toward a global or very widespread cataclysmic event. A description of the pre-flood conditions on the earth is given in Genesis 2:5-8. The Lord had not caused it to rain on the earth, and there was no man to till the ground, but a mist went up from the earth and watered the whole face of the ground. This could be describing a local condition. However, just after the flood occurs, God promises Noah that he will never destroy the earth again by the flood, and his assurance is a rainbow observed in the sky. All of this seems to indicate a much more arid atmosphere before the flood occurred, followed by a much more humid atmosphere afterward. To suddenly completely change the Earth's atmosphere, even on a local scale, would take a massive, catastrophic, a borderline earth-rending event. And this is reflected in the description of the flood in Genesis 7:11. All of the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. Not only that, but if this was a global event, such changes to the atmosphere would certainly have direct effects on lifespan and natural habitats. And this is reflected by the sudden drop in lifespan recorded in the Bible. I posit a question to the historians who doubt the biblical flood account. How would an ancient civilization know that changes to the atmosphere would likely affect lifespans? Even the biblical narrative states God's intent to reduce lifespans before the flood, so it seems the ancient belief was that this was due primarily to God's judgment, not that it was a natural outworking of changes in the atmosphere. Frankly, my belief is that it was both, but the naturalistic explanation isn't present in the Bible. I should mention these descriptions have led to what is called hydroplate theory, the idea that before the flood, the thin crust of the earth was floating on top of water that had become pressurized. However, spreading this idea to a worldwide phenomena is admittedly unlikely, but a similar concept on a relatively large but local scale is possible considering some volcanic rocks such as pumice float on water due to their porous gas-filled nature once solidified. In fact, this phenomenon was observed after the eruption of Krakatoa, where large pumice fragments formed floating rafts miles away from the eruption due to rapid cooling and trapped gases. If you've been to Hawaii, you can run into this stuff. There are rocks. You can throw them into water, they'll float. Now extrapolate this idea to an early forming Earth with multiple large volcanoes. With hundreds of volcanoes continuously erupting thousands of years after the atmosphere had cooled enough for liquid water to exist on the surface. In fact, such continuous eruption could cause conditions similar to a volcanic winter, leading to a mini ice age that could bury frozen lakes under miles of ash and debris. As evidence for this, scientists have observed many subglacial or deep aquifers miles below the surface during explorations. One such discovery, Lake Vostok, measures 155 miles long, 31 miles wide, and is composed of an estimated 1.43 quadrillion gallons of water. That's 1.43 times 10 to the 15th gallons. Granted, this is small compared to the volume of the ocean, but it is still conceivable to think that a vast ancient frozen subterranean reservoir, perhaps formed under ice sheets or in tectonic basins, could suddenly release due to seismic activity or pressure buildup after millions or billions of years of remaining hidden and sealed, causing either a local or global cataclysmic event. If, for example, something along the lines of a massive supervolcano erupted, similar to Yellowstone, or a meteorite impacted, or long-term subduction led to the walls breaking down of one of these underwater lake beds, a massive underground surge of water could release, and water would burst forth from the ground, with much of it being vaporized, causing unusual precipitation, and possibly having global impacts on the atmosphere and environment. I will say one more time, this doesn't mean the entire surface would necessarily be affected. So how can we reconcile this with uninterrupted historic records like those from China and Egypt? Perhaps their location largely spared them from the disaster. Even in more arid conditions, Egypt and China are well known to have large natural springs near historic sites. If the biblical description of water misting the ground through porous strata like pumice is correct, and the atmosphere was far more arid, given the fertile nature of volcanic soil, you could expect that most vegetarian life would exist in regions where these natural springs or this mist would be found, since food and water would be more abundant around these locations. The locations where water was misting the ground would also be just above where pressurized lake beds existed, perhaps where our oceans and seas now reside. Unfortunately, this means that much like the mythical lost city of Atlantis, any evidence of such pre-flood civilizations would be buried thousands of feet under water and sediment beyond our current technology's reach. Of course, none of what I've said is definitive. However, my objective is only to open your mind to the possibilities. To completely dismiss all of the Bible and its history over theoretical and geotechnical models of the early Earth that will likely be overturned multiple times in the next 100 years is nonsensical. Even when I was in school, the geological model of the Earth layers changed more than once, but I digress. Suffice it to say, this will remain a debated topic. My only comment is not to believe people who tell you they know for sure what happened 5,000 years ago and can't predict the weather more than 3 hours out accurately, much less years. Seriously, talk to a pilot. Case in point, one of the greatest embarrassments to the scientific community was their predictions about what would happen due to CO2 emissions. I'm not saying that they don't have a significant effect, but they said Florida would be partway underwater by now, multiple islands would be submerged, and yet the measurements show an irrelevant change in oceanic levels over the last 30 years. To this day, we have politicians buying beachfront property at a discount while screaming we're all going to drown or burn up. And then they refuse to regulate China, who is threatening to over double their already outrageous and literally suffocating emission levels in the next 10 years. Again, I digress. If nothing else, this should be a strict warning to those who blindly follow scientific consensus, as was COVID. But again, and again, and again, I digress. These are subjects for another video. Finally and lastly, let's talk about the evidence for the New Testament of the Bible. I promise you this will be much quicker than the evidence I presented for the Old Testament, since we're both closer to the recorded events in time, meaning there are more surviving records, and for other reasons which I will explain. It is true that the oldest complete New Testament, the Sinaiticus, is dated between 325 AD and 360 AD. However, multiple fragments of the New Testament date to before this range, and there are quotations from early church fathers that date back to within 100 years of the events recorded. Altogether, we have around 86,000 quotations of the New Testament by the early church fathers before the 4th century, accounting for around 50% of the New Testament total, though that total of directly quoted verses is debated, with some Christian scholars quoting a much higher number. J. Warner Wallace, an ex-detective and author of Cold Case Christianity, also discusses a chain of custody for all the books in the New Testament, showing how the writings of the apostles and the Gospels were handed down from the apostle to teacher to student over the first few hundred years after the death and resurrection of Jesus based on their quotations. Many people point to the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD as the origin of canon for the New Testament, but this is a common misconception. The Council of Nicaea was called to discuss Arianism, which is the belief that Jesus was created instead of eternal, and which thereby directly contradicts Scripture. This resulted in the Nicene Creed, not the canon. The New Testament was well in circulation and being used by the church long before the Council of Nicaea ever met, and this is apparent based on historic evidence like the Muratorian fragment dated to 170 AD, which contains the oldest currently known list of books for the New Testament. This list includes essentially all of the New Testament, except Hebrews, which is known to have been written late, James, and 1st and 2nd Peter. However, 1st and 2nd Peter are in the chain of custody I previously mentioned, and James is known to have been quoted by Irenaeus before the 3rd century. So what are the arguments against the New Testament as a historic text? Historians argue that 200 years after the events makes the books too late to be trusted. Now ask them to do the same for Islam, and watch them shrink back. Of course, this argument, just like all other arguments against the Bible, is so biased it's ridiculous. They have no issue believing the writings of Herodotus, Thucydides, Aristotle, or Suetonius, even though the earliest copies of their writings date to 800 plus years after the events they record. But having a complete book written less than 300 years after the events with fragments within 100, that they're fully and irrationally willing to disregard. Fine, burn all the history books. We have no written records of history that can be trusted before the last 500 years, besides maybe a few stone artifacts here and there, if that is their standard. And who knows if what's written on these memorials is the truth, or if they're all liars. Of course, I'm being facetious, but the level of cope these historians display in order to justify their atheistic worldview is appalling, to say the least. Historians will begrudgingly agree that Jesus was a real person and that Christians existed only because of Josephus, Tacitus, Pliny, Thallus, and many others who lived in the 1st and 2nd century, and whose earliest copies are dated to long after our fragments of the Bible. I'm certain it must be a thorn in their side, especially since Thallus, who lived within 25 years of Jesus' crucifixion, confirmed the biblical narrative that there was a solar eclipse on the day Jesus died. Anyway, I remind the audience that what I've just presented is not even scratching the surface with regards to the historic evidence that confirms the Bible. And there are literal mountains of books written about all the artifacts and other extra-biblical evidence that attests to the Bible's historicity. Of course, there are also controversies regarding certain subjects, but as we've seen, none of them involve incontrovertible evidence. Typically, it comes down to the opinions of historians that are later overturned when new evidence is introduced. Perhaps this is why historian and archaeologist Nelson Glueck, who uncovered 1,500 ancient sites, boldly proclaimed it may be stated categorically that no archaeological discovery has ever controverted a single biblical reference. He further boasted about the almost incredibly accurate historical memory of the Bible, and particularly so when it is fortified by archaeological fact. It is my conclusion that the Bible is a uniquely historical and ancient series of texts like no other in existence, just based on the archaeological evidence. But there is more to the uniqueness of the Bible than can be expressed on a historic basis alone. Anyway, that is it for this discussion on the historic evidence of the Bible. I'm going to get into some of the more philosophical evidence for the Bible in just a moment, but I'm going to cut this video here. Thank you guys for watching and have a blessed day.